welcome. This is a bit of an experiment, so we'll see how this goes. This is a bit strange for me because I'm interviewing my boss.
I'm not your boss. Rachel's your boss.
Rachel's my boss, to be fair. Yeah,
Rachel is also my boss.
and an old friend, I guess, these days. So, welcome, Martin. Welcome to Copenhagen. How are you feeling so far?
Pretty reasonable. Yeah, mustn't grumble. That's what we always say in Britain about that question.
So I guess I was thinking because obviously we've spent quite a lot of time together over the years. So I was thinking about what other people might want to know in terms of questions. So I guess, you've been involved in software engineering for a decent amount of time. I don't want to go into how many years though.
Since the 80s.
Since the 80s. So I think the first thing I'd like to ask is, obviously you were there at what became the birth of the Agile software development movement.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind talking a little bit about how you got involved in that to start with, and what sort of got you into that group, I guess?
That could be quite a long answer.
That's fine. We have 45 minutes.
Well, the first step in that really was getting involved in the object-oriented community. I wasn't so much involved on the programming side, at least not initially, but on the analysis and design side. I worked for one of the what was the Big Seven, I think, at the time, consulting companies. Coopers and Lybrand, or as I have since referred to them, Cheetham and Lightone, which says something about my opinion of their approach to their consulting. But they got involved with this small company that was interested in doing essentially graphical modeling approaches. And that company talked a lot about objects and object-oriented thinking, although, as I came to understand it, they didn't really understand very much about object-oriented thinking. But that kind of got me into this world that grew at the time of object-oriented analysis design. There was a whole bunch of different approaches that sort of flowed into what became unified modeling language. But that was kind of my centerpiece. But in doing that, one of the things that I also realized is I didn't really understand. I didn't felt comfortable just operating at this diagram level. I also wanted to understand what the code did.
Right.
The diagram level was very useful in talking to non-programmers and helping to understand conceptual models, and that was an area I got very interested in. That's actually what was the basis of my first book, Analysis Patterns. But I also needed to get involved in the programming because I needed to understand how the things got rigorous.
Yeah.
And there's lots of things about that one could talk about. But that got me into Smalltalk and C++, with the two dominant programming languages of the time, of which Smalltalk was particularly interesting because it was an incredibly advanced programming environment at that time in the 80s and 90s. Yep. And within the object-oriented community, there was a push towards doing much more iterative approaches to running projects. So, we would say things like, we've got to have shorter iterative cycles. You may need to release in as quickly as 6 months. And that kind of approach and thinking, and also the way that the Smalltalk community was trying to think in terms of faster cycles and the like, naturally led into that. So that kind of put me in the kind of rough space. And also then ran into other people who were in that OO space, and that included Kent Beck and Ward Cunningham, which were the big Smalltalk gurus at the time. But what really then cranked this up was the fact that one of my consulting clients at the time was Chrysler, and working with their payroll system, and it led to this very not strange, actually quite normal, but still rather uncomfortable situation where I was, there was a contracting company who were doing the building and the programming for this. And I was kind of an external consultant, and they were trying to push me away because I might disagree with them, which I did actually on occasions, because I said, really uncomfortable and unfashionable things like, you really ought to start thinking about testing right from the start. And then when their project kind of crashed and burned, Kent came in to basically get it back rolling again. And he decided not to throw me away. And I ended up helping Kent with that project. And that was the project that first pulled together extreme programming. And I mean, we were already had some similar ideas about a number of things, including the value of testing, because testing is really important. And we were interested in using object-oriented design and the like. But what was very different was his approach to design process. I still felt, in the sense, that you had to figure out a lot of things in advance.
Up front.
And then I was still thinking in terms of cycles, but we're talking about cycles of weeks and months rather than the kind of cycles he was thinking about. And I was definitely not comfortable with the idea of, well, you don't even think about it until you need to get to that need, the Yagni notion. But working with Kent, I realized that if you've got the kind of testing approach that he talked about, and you've got the continuous integration, the rapid cycling, you can actually, you have this thing called refactoring, which I had not come across before. And you can rapidly change things, and that leads you to a much more evolutionary approach to your software development. You can rethink what it means to do design. And design is not something you do before programming. Even in a weekly or monthly cycle, it's something that's totally intertwined with the programming exercise itself. And that completely rewired my mind about thinking about the role of design. And so that, and extreme programming, that was, of course, one of the foundations of where Agile went to from there. So that was kind of my route into it. It was through the object-oriented community, through the small talk world, complete accident of running into Kent at a very important time, and then following Kent.
I mean, you could have gone the other way and just ended up with UML the whole time.
Well,
the UML, sorry.
That was an important part of my consulting work. I mean, I would often be called into companies to teach them about UML, and I'd say, well, actually, you should do about smaller iterative cycles, and you should, and maybe if I thought they were really, really good clients, I might say, actually, there's this thing called extreme programming. Don't run away from it. It's actually pretty good. And of course, my best client took that advice and really ran with it, and ended up employing me. I, as an independent consultant, I said, I still remember when I left the small company that I worked for after Coopers and Lybrand, I became an independent consultant and said, I will never work for anybody again, thank goodness. And then I joined Thoughtworks in the year 2000, and I've been with them ever since. And they haven't fired me yet.
When's this going out? I mean,
who knows?
I've been involved in the XP community for a long time myself now, and there are some things about XP that I still, even after being involved for such a long time, I still have questions about. And so, when we talk about the Chrysler, when you talk about the Chrysler project, thinking in particular about things like on-site customer present the whole time. Right. Was that something you actually had, day to day, was sitting?
Very much so, because one of the main business people who ran the whole the payroll operation, Marie, was very much engaged. In fact, a little bit too engaged in some ways, because she worked herself too hard. Yeah. And she was actually. There's a couple of other people working with her. And she was sitting, the whole point was she was sitting in the developers area with the developer team, so that there was a kind of, we carved out, we had to really strong arm the cubicle police to change individual cubicles into this little team area. And the team area, the developers all had paired workstations in. This was very dramatic in cubicle land. And she had a separate little area just right next to that. And the whole thing was, if we had questions, we could just go up and say to Marie, how do you want this to work? How does this need to operate? And so she was very closely embedded, and her team was very much embedded with us, with the developer team. And that was very much a part of it. And that's actually a part of things that it still matters a huge amount to me, and it's one of these things that is lost in too many places where I hear people talking about Agile, is this fact that you need the business expertise right next to you, so that when you're sitting there and you think, oh, how does this thing need to work? rather than puzzle over it yourself, you can just swing around or just walk a few steps and actually ask a person how to do it. And you need to be on first name terms with the people who are doing that. And I think that makes a huge difference. I remember talking to a team, and this was because of one of our client kind of situations, where we were doing some software for a business situation where there were 4 business users of this software. It was really important planning software, logistics kind of stuff. And there were 4 business people, and we had a development team of about 4 or 5 people. They had never, ever spoken to each other. All communication, this was client mandate, had to be done through a product owner. And by the way, there had been 3 product owners over the course of 6 months. It was almost like, if you want to completely torpedo a project, that would be a very good way of doing so. In fact, I once was on stage as a personification of the werewolf of software development. That's exactly what he would do to screw that project over. Right? No, you want to be on first name with the people who are either using or commissioning the software, so that you can understand how things, because the best software is about the ideas coming from both places. It's about, they have an idea and you know about software, they know about the business, and you bounce ideas back off each other, and it's out of that interaction that the best ideas come. And if you break that interaction down, then you're really crippling yourself. And unfortunately, I hear so many Agile projects that do things like this company did, and throw an intermediary in the way.
I remember a talk you did. I think it was with Dan North.
With Daniel, yes, the yawning crevasse of doom.
Yeah, yawning crevasse of doom. And I actually saw the degenerate case of this, essentially, where it was at a retailer, and they had a campus. It was an out-of-town campus, and they had the quote business folks who were the sort of controllers of the brands and the designers, and they were in one building, and there was literally 100-meter deep trench. With a single bridge across it, and then you had all the developers and IT people on the other side of this trench, and it was like the physical embodiment of the yawning crevasse of doom, which I think is a wonderful thing to see. I thought it was a wonderful thing to see, and likewise they never spoke. And I remember speaking to one of the controllers of one of the brands, very senior person in this organisation, and I asked them, how do you feel about working with IT? And she said, I feel completely alone.
Yeah. But sometimes you see the reverse. I remember going to another client of ours, which was a bank in Australia, and they were doing a office move, and several of the business leaders had looked at the plans of the office and said, "This isn't right. There's no room for the programmers here. They need to be with us in that group." And you knew when that was happening that we'd had success, right? When they understood the value of it. But and there's lots of other little stories of break that barrier down, because that is one of the biggest barriers that we have to face, and we're still fighting it. Even now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's. I do remember another entertaining story. Is it Matt Femmel, I think it was, who's one of the people behind the original idea of continuous integration. I think he wrote the first, or was involved in writing the first CI server, cruise control.
Yep.
And he was working in London for AOL. It's a very long time ago now, so I can probably.
America Online, yes. Yeah. You remember that, AOL?
The walled garden, brilliant, yeah. The hands up in
the floppy disks.
Yeah. The internet on the floppy. I think Australia still gets the internet that way, doesn't it? I'm not sure. But,
feels like it at times, yes.
And again, it was Cubeland, and Matt was trying to get these dismantled, and they weren't having a bean of this at all. So a weekend passed, and screwdriver later, everyone turned up in the morning on the Monday, and all the cubicles had disappeared. He'd taken them all down. He got into a bit of trouble, but hey, yeah. The other thing, and that I'm always fascinated by, and I don't think I've ever managed to do this successfully, is use the concept of metaphor from XP. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know it's a bit of a niche thing, but it's an interesting part of design.
Well, at the original Chrysler project, Kent pushed very hard to have some kind of metaphor for the system, and we ended up with a metaphor was kind of like a factory. You had parts, And if there were financial transactions, but they were parts and bins. So it was as if the financial transactions were parts and accounts were bins. And it kind of worked, partly because it was different mental model to what had been going on before. And so it helped people make a shift of saying, oh, I've got to rethink my mental model. I'm not sure that I like... I've not really seen metaphor work since.
You're right, yeah.
I'm much more of the ubiquitous language notion that Eric Evans says. We need to find a language that the business people use and the technical people use, and we need to have people speaking that same language, which is not going to be a case of just listen to the business language. You need to construct a rigorous language that both will understand, because the natural language has all sorts of little inconsistencies and things that we can smooth over in our day-to-day understanding, except when we don't. But the computer can't deal with those, at least pre-AI what's it stuff it can't. And as a result, we need that ubiquitous language greatly helps communication. I mean, the goal should be that in many ways that you should be able to have a business person can look at your code for a particular part of a system and have at least a rough idea of what it's doing. Right? They won't fully understand everything, but they're going to look and sense, I can kind of feel, the words look familiar, the vocabulary looks kind of familiar. And that's what you should be striving for, because if you're constantly speaking in that language between the developers, as it were, it's embedding that knowledge of the business and making it used to talk to the domain people. But so I'm much more in favor of that rather than the metaphor idea. I think it kind of worked in that one case, but I'm not sure that it was more generalizable. Although it was very interesting to think about, of course, the role that metaphor plays in understanding and learning, as raised this morning, and to what extent that can sort of play a role as well. But I think primarily ubiquitous language is the way to go.
Cool, thank you. So I guess rolling forward a bit, you mentioned joining Thoughtworks in 2001. Of course, you find yourself somehow amongst this group of I would say fairly opinionated people who got together to I guess create what became the Agile Manifesto. I mean, obviously, unless Kent Beck is here, I'm not sure if he is, but I don't think anyone else was in the room. Could you talk us through a little bit about what happened in that workshop?
It's amazing how little I remember of it,
really?
Actually.
Okay, this is a very short answer to a question then. But.
I mean, I can remember some of the setup to it. Because Kent organised a extreme programming get-together about a year beforehand in middle of nowhere, Oregon, which is where he was living at the time, and invited a whole bunch of people, many of which were heavily involved in the extreme programming community, but some were more adjacent, like Jim Highsmith, for instance. And at that time, extreme programming was really leading this wave of new lightweight methodologies, because we didn't use the term Agile at the time. And one of the questions was, people were looking at what Kent was doing and saying, we really like a lot of what you have, but we don't like all of it. But we still, there's some similar ideas, and the Scrum folks, and what Jim Highsmith was talking about, should extreme programming refer to this broad notion of these lightweight approaches, or should it be very narrowly focused on what Kent was focused on doing? And it was during that meeting that Kent said, no, I want this to be the narrow focus, because I want to concentrate on this particular thing that I am pushing. So then that question is, well, what of the broader thing? And so that led to folks looking to organize a broader thing that was looking to bring in folks like the Scrum folks and into a separate workshop. There was some argument about whether it should be held at Anguilla, because Big Dave Thomas wanted be involved, so he wanted it at his house. But Alistair Coburn insisted on it being in Snowbird because he didn't want to travel all the way to Anguilla. So he said, let's have it near Salt Lake City. And for whatever reason, Alistair won out. We preferred the snow to the warmth for some reason. I don't know what it was.
More skiers than divers.
No, who knows? I mean, I don't. That's one part of the stuff I don't remember. And invitations were sent out to various people, and some people accepted, and some people didn't. And random 17 of us got together at Snowbird for that. As to the actual mechanics of the event itself, I remember amazingly little about it. I mean, I look back at it and think, why did I not take notes? Why did I not? But I didn't think it was going to be a big deal. And I have a memory of Robert Martin saying, I want a manifesto out of this. And I thought, yeah, well, it might be fun to create one, but it's not going to have any impact. I remember us arguing about what word to use and deciding on Agile in the end. And I remember little snippets around that. But the actual process of coming up with the manifesto, the this over that, which is a magnificent centerpiece of it, who came up with that, I have no idea. Or how it kind of emerged. Absolutely blank slate.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing. I guess running forward a little bit more. There's a very well-known article that you wrote on your Blicky called "Is Design Dead?" Which is one of the things that I've kind of as a young programmer I sort of read, and it sort of blew my mind a bit. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that predates the Agile Manifesto. It was something. It was really me trying to make sense of what I saw with Kent's very evolutionary approach to software development, to the design stage in development. And so what I like many of the best things I've written, I didn't really understand what I was writing about until I wrote it, right? The best writing for me is where I don't really fully understand something and I'm working it through by trying to make sense of it in my writing. And that came through with a notion of saying, well, if you're thinking of software design, you can either plan your design before you program, and I'm not necessarily saying spend 6 months to do design and before you program. I'm talking even at the weeks level, right? But you design first, then implement it. Or you can kind of do what bad people do and just kind of mix up the design and the programming as you go. And I said bad people because a sense of, well, you're not really thinking it through properly in that sense. But if, on the other hand, you have an environment that makes that programming and design work together, and so what do you need to do that? You need the testing. You need a language and environment that allows you to construct things, which object orientation gave us, particularly one that allows rapid change, which Smalltalk gave you. And of course Java was coming up at that time as well, and it's not Smalltalk, nothing is, but you know, it was certainly better than what you could do with C++. And if you're working in a team, you need to be able to integrate with other people so that you're not going off on different paths. If you've got those kinds of things to go together, then you can make this process of designing and programming together work. And what's more, it's then become, you can actually use the programming as a feedback system, because what you can't do when you're drawing on a whiteboard is test that whiteboard out, other than mentally, this is how I imagine things would work. And what we've found again and again and again is that once you actually start writing the code and get the computer to execute, it does things that you weren't expecting. Unless you're some kind of brilliant level that I'm not. I'm always, well, I told it to do that, and that's the consequence. Well, that's wrong, isn't it? But you can use that cycle. You can use that cycle to actually improve your design process. And then when you start doing that, you begin to realize, I don't necessarily need to cover all the cases that we might run into until I actually need to hit that case. Because if I'm doing something, I'm never backing myself into a corner. I can always move it because I know the refactoring and I have the tests as a base. And I've got a flexibility. There was this notion in the time that once you started writing code, it was like pouring concrete. You could not change the system once you started coding it. And what these techniques gave you was the ability to make that design become an evolutionary thing. And of course that whole then leads into the whole evolutionary architecture, which other colleagues of mine here have written more about. But it all comes from the fact that you can change your attitude to design. And that's what is design dead. It was to say, no, it hasn't died, but it has changed significantly. And the way you think about design has to change. And that was what the thing was just working through that thought. Which to me is very much at the heart of what matters in Agile thinking. But of course one of the problems is that if you take the Agile moniker and you don't do the technical practices that support it, you're going to not experience that thing. And that's, of course, what happens with a lot of the flaccid scrum, as I call it, or even worse things that we can say around SAFe, where you're trying to go through the motions on the business side, but without the technical practices, you can't actually move the code base in that kind of way. And then, of course, you have other practices that come across it. Like one of the biggest barriers that we faced right on that very first work I did with Thoughtworks was, well, what happens when you've got a relational database? Because we may be able to flex the code, but there's no way you're going to flex the data. Fortunately, we had a secret weapon. He's called Pramod Sadalji, and he figured out how to flex the data. And once you have that, okay, I can evolutionary design on the database too. And Pramod saved the day. And those kind of steps help bring you forwards.
I often think, actually, he wrote the book Refactoring Databases, was
yes.
it? Yeah. Which is in your signature series, yeah.
Yep.
Which is, I don't know if people in the room have come across it. It's one of these sort of lost masterpieces in some sense. It's not that many people have seem to have come across it or read it, but it introduces a lot of very interesting refactorings for
it basically means that you can evolve the database design and schema, and even a live database with live data in it, in the same way we can evolve the code. We use it a lot at Thoughtworks, but I hear that outside it's not as well known, which is a terrible shame. And Pramod really did make one of the biggest leaps forward, I think, by developing that. And he ought to be better recognized for that, because it makes, if you're working in data-intensive systems, being able to evolve the database
and it doesn't actually
schema is huge.
It doesn't actually relate just to relational databases, does it? Because there are absolute parallels with
parallels in lots of other database stuff as well, because schema migration and being able to migrate the data as well is crucial, because that's what's hard. I mean, it's easy to change the schema, but you've got to move all the data in an operational system at the same time. And once you've figured out how to do that, then you can really motor.
I think at this point, I'd probably like to open up to questions in the room. So if anyone's got any questions, we're going to get...
we need to get them on the mic because it's being recorded,
yes.
So we need to do it that way.
So I wanted to ask about the customer notion that you mentioned earlier regarding also the involvement in the Agile Manifesto and so on. What do you have to say about currently most of the companies, at least that I have seen, the customer is not there because maybe the product is like an enterprise customer. They have like 100 or maybe 1,000 of them. The only relation to the customer is through the product owner and whatever he's doing on his side. So what sort of like opinion maybe on that, or how to deal with that given the,
Well, I mean, the way I look at it is the customer is people who understand the business side of things. And part of the trick is to find out where do I get a representative customer group that can be deeply involved in the project on a day-to-day basis. And it may involve, if you're in an enterprise organization and you've got a bunch of users, you find some of those users and say, let's get one or two of them involved, and do something like that. Or somebody who is understanding the overall business process and looking to how the business process should develop and change in the future. Get them involved directly. That's really what I'm talking about here, is you want that people with the knowledge of the business. The problem of the product owner example that I gave earlier on, which is not a diss at all product owners, it was just this particular case, was you're parachuting somebody who doesn't know the business and doesn't know technology in the middle to handle the conversation. That's what you've got to avoid. Right? What instead you need is in the Yawning Crevasse of Doom talk that Daniel and I gave, that we said the role of a product owner isn't to be the sole communicator of all communication between the two. It's instead to say, okay, I need to bring this person from the business side and this developer together to have a direct conversation. So that they're acting as a bridge to enable conversations to occur on that bridge, rather than being the communications conduit. So that's a bunch of thoughts around that. But that communication flow between the people using the software and the people writing the software is a crucial communication flow to work on.
Thank you. I think there was one down the front here as well. Another
Yeah,
question.
we have one here.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It's right in front of the speaker, so you might have to step aside. But let's see.
So, pair programming, a practice heavily part of XP, and we use it in all kinds of different processes nowadays. Do you think if you do a lot of it, does it select for extroverted developers to become more senior and more successful? And is there a way to have practices around pair programming or just separate other practices that include a lot of great minds that are more introverted or more anxious to deal with people in general?
I do think there's some sense in the sense that some people will be more comfortable pairing than others, and that is a factor because human beings are different. Different people are different, and that's something we have to bear in mind. And I've always felt that processes should be selected by the teams that work with them. What is, however, also true is that many people who don't think they'd like pair programming find out they do like it when they actually try it and learn how to do it properly. And I don't think it's an extrovert-introvert thing, because I know plenty of introverts who enjoy pair programming. I mean, to me, well, both of us, in fact. I mean, to me, the thing about introvert-extrovert is the problem for someone who is an introvert is finding energy really being depleted when working, particularly with people you don't know. You know, for me, the classic case for me is invite me to a party with a bunch of people I don't know, and I will stand in a corner for 30 minutes until I think I can run away. That's my introvert behavior, right? On the other hand, sit with James and we work on a programming problem together, we can do it for ages. Because the introvert is not triggered by somebody you know well. And if you're on a full-time project with people, you get to know them well. So that doesn't necessarily trigger the introvert reaction. Now, that's not necessarily meaning that everybody can pair. But I do think everybody should try pairing. Because even if you think you don't like it, you might find you do. And then when you do it, and if you learn how to do it well and effectively, and it does require a bit of teaching to learn how to do it, coaching to do that, the effectiveness of it is surprising.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm going to add something as well. I mean, it's a skill like any other as well, pair programming, right? You need to learn and develop that skill. So if you're a novice at doing it, it's going to feel difficult and awkward. And especially if you're paired with an expert. You've got someone who's sort of internalized all the practices and working with someone who's just starting off. That's a really awkward set of interactions often. And there's lots of ideas about how you manage that. There's the Prag Dave's book on refactoring your wetware. What was
that? Was Andy's, wasn't it?
Was it Andy's? Andy Hunt's, right?
Andy Hunt's, yeah.
Andy's and Prag programmers. But they talk a lot about that in how you can effectively pair different skill levels together to actually make.
And I'd also very much recommend the article that's on martinfowler.com called On Pair Programming, which is written by Nina and Birgitta. And Birgitta is here. And they wrote, I thought, a superb article on how to do pair programming effectively and signs that it's working well and that kind of thing. And if you've got any questions about pair programming, I would definitely start with that article because it's just out there on the web and written by a couple of people who definitely know their stuff when it comes to pairing.
Thank you very much. Lucas, from the site, huge fan of your work. Thank you for refactoring. I cannot escape Gen AI, time and LLMs. It's everywhere, even in toothbrushes those days. And I've been working with it to some extent for a year. I am chapter away from finishing book, and I know that it cannot summarize. It's hallucinating so much that it made me better writer and developer because I don't trust it to such a degree that I basically check every sentence what it's throwing at me. But yet I see at the conferences this proverb, trust but verify. After 1 year, I say don't trust and verify. So I'd like to raise awareness about this sentence as you, faces of the IT industry, to think more carefully about it. What's your thoughts? Thank you very much.
I mean, it's something that we are still learning about how to use effectively. I'm not I'm less interested in its ability to generate code, more interested in its ability to analyze a lot of information and get you started towards looking at it. So one interesting thing that I've talked about, but well, I've not talked about, I've published, some colleagues of ours have worked on, is investigating it for looking at large legacy systems. And the idea here is you don't use GenAI alone, you use it in combination with other techniques. So the example here is they'll take that legacy system and they will do non-AI based analysis to basically take the AST of the system and stick it into a network database. Then they use GenAI and they go off and they look at all sorts of things around it. Could be user manuals, process guides, emails talking about the system, bug reports, all sorts of crap that's totally unstructured. And they will use that information to annotate that network database with information. That's one role that the GenAI can use. Then at the other end, when you look to say, how do I talk to this database and extract information, again the GenAI tool can come out. So you can say things like, what the hell happens to this record as it flows through the system? And it will tell you, it will summarize the process for you, but also give you pointers to say, go to line 765 in this file and look at these emails that talked about how it needed to be changed. And that allows you to understand what that legacy system is doing so much better. And we're getting some initial feedbacks that are saying that things that otherwise were taking people days to do, to figure out how to make a change, can be done in hours. Now, early days. And I'm not necessarily saying that's the only use. That's the kind of use that I think is interesting. It very much relies on it not giving definitive answers, because they do LLMs hallucinate naturally, and so we have to bear that in mind. But if you combine it with other techniques, then you can get some really interesting things going on. And actually, the person who needs to be sitting here to talk about this more is Birgitta, who I mentioned early on as the co-author of the pair programming. She's been very much leading my colleagues' work in this kind of stuff and seeing how it can work with our work. And there's a lot of very interesting things here. But it has to do also with the whole software process, not just the writing of code. I mean, one interesting technique is brainstorming for threat analysis. Throw the STRIDE guidelines for threat analysis. I don't know if people have heard of the STRIDE. Have people heard of these? A few of you? Okay. So another article from my website to mention to you. I know I talk about the stuff on my website a lot. It's because I haven't got time to read anything else. So. But a colleague of ours wrote a book about an article about threat modeling, which talks about threat modeling is not some fancy thing that you need serious security people to do, and they come in every 6 months to do threat analysis. No, it's not like that. You follow this workshop guideline, and every couple of weeks you spend an hour or maybe an hour and a half doing some threat analysis on your system. The team does it. Maybe you get a security person in to kind of act as an advisor a little bit, but mostly the team does it themselves. It's not that complicated. And the STRIDE model is one of the models that is used to help come up with questions to ask. Well, you can also throw these at a GenAI thing and say, hey, use the STRIDE model, analyze this picture of our system, and tell us about a whole bunch of threats. And yeah, it may be that half those threats are totally unrealistic, which is about as it goes for doing a threat modeling workshop. But it'll help come up with ideas, help juice your thinking. And I think that's one of the best things about GenAI things is they can be very good at coming up with first drafts. They're not very good at coming up with a final product, but they can be very nice for coming up with first drafts.
I thought I'd ask, because we're coming up about 5 minutes, I think, left to go. So I thought I'd ask a completely non-controversial question at this point, which is, could you offer some comments on developer productivity? Because there seems to be quite a focus on that at the moment.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, I captured all my thoughts on this a long time ago in a post I did on my site, and it is titled "Cannot Measure Productivity." So I'm giving you a bit of an answer. When people talk about measuring something, they're usually looking for a often singular scalar number, right? If you how tall is James? Measure James Lewis's height. They're not. You're looking for a number, right? 6 feet or whatever it is, right? And when people look at productivity, they're often asking for similar things. And you know they're looking for similar things because people will say, oh, give me and we hear it all the time, give me a percentage figure of how much Gen AI will improve the productivity of our developers. So they're asking for a number. And there is realistically no number. And often even the dimensions of a number are not understood properly. Because, I mean, people have argued, well, yeah, well, maybe lines of code isn't such a good measure after all, so we'll use function points or something. And they're talking about the output that a developer creates. And I would argue it's got nothing to do with the output a developer makes. It's the outcome on the users. Are they more effective? As Kathy Sierra, wonderful Kathy Sierra, for those who remember her work, and if you don't, go and Google Kathy Sierra's work. She would say, we're here to make our users kick ass, make their jobs much more effective. And that's what productivity measure should be based on. How is our users' lives made more effective and better and more efficient by our work? And if that means I can write 3 lines of code over the course of 6 months, but they really help the user kick ass, that is way more effective than somebody who works hard doing something. Because the skill, of course, is figuring out how to write those 3 lines, right? So, in broad, productivity is actually a much more multi-layered thing. And I think some of the best work that's been done on this is Nicole Forsgren and the space stuff, and do take a look at that. It's not quantitative. It's certainly not a single number. It's something that involves a lot of ways of looking at things, many of which are non-quantitative. And in particular, it's got to be based on how we're making the users of our software more effective, because that, in the end, is what matters.
Cool. And do we have time? Thank you. Do we have time for one more?
One final question. I think we have one here. That was here. I have to walk even further here.
There's been a lot of disquiet in the industry about Agile recently. A lot of people saying maybe it's reaching its end. A lot of people may be suggesting there's need for a reboot. What do you think is actually going to happen in that space? Is the reboot the right thing? Do we need a new brand to allow us to continue the great principles that are behind Agile?
I'm not in favor of rebranding because it'll just continue to cycle the same way anyway. I mean, I would argue we haven't actually got started with Agile in most places, because a lot of what is done under the name Agile is a long distance from what either the 17 of us or just what we operate and do. And so my goal always with the Agile Manifesto stuff and advocating for it since has not been to necessarily say the whole industry is going to do this, because I'm realistic in my expectations. But to make it safe for those who can to do. I mean, I remember in the early 2000s, we really struggled at Thoughtworks to be able to work the way we wanted to work. And what I've always hoped is that we could actually get to the point where saying, no, you should work the way you work because you're clearly very effective at doing that. And that should be the goal, is to make it as able to work in that way. Agile is not necessarily the best answer for every situation anyway. Most things are contextual. But it's been the context I've got so familiar with that I've now kind of collapsed in a bubble. But the biggest problem we have is not that the difficulties that Agile has, it's how hard to teach people to do it well. And if I have a single reference, and it's not going to be something on my website for once, to knowing how to do Agile, I really recommend The Art of Agile Development by Jim Shaw. I think he's done one of the best jobs of really culling and pulling that together, and it's no surprise that he's deeply rooted in extreme programming, which is, I still think, the most important because of the fact that it combines the technical and the communication side together in a way that most of the other approaches have not.
Okay. thank you for the questions. Thank you all for the questions. Thanks all for coming. And most of all, I think thank you, Martin, for agreeing to be an interview today. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.